Hello, my name is Erica Gumany, and today we'll be talking about brave and respectful leadership in times of change. I'll be discussing the film from 2006 called The Queen that starred Helen Mirren as the Queen of England and Michael Sheen as Tony Blair, the Prime Minister. And I love what it says here, where tradition prepared her and change will define her. This is a very interesting movie that kind of looks at the behind the scenes from the Queen's perspective of the time when Princess Diana died. The timeline of the movie really begins when Tony Blair is established as the youngest Prime Minister of England in May of 1997, and then summarizes the months up to August 31st when Princess Diana dies in the tragic car crash in France, and then the days leading up to the funeral on September 6th that was held at Westminster Abbey with over 2,000 attendees, but of course was viewed by millions across the world. So this picture to me is a great depiction of the importance of tradition and modernization, which this movie talks a lot about. So when we think of change, we think of, oh, that's great, new ideas, innovation, who wants to do things the same old way? But this picture really shows the importance of respecting the way things have been done and how it shows Tony Blair coming in as the new prime minister and respecting the Queen of England as he begins his role. When Tony Blair was campaigning to become prime minister, his focus was really about upsetting the establishment and fighting against the way things were and switching privilege from the few to the many, and wanting to make things different. And challenging the Constitution. And it was said in the movie that what he was thinking about, the kind of change he was wanting, hasn't been done for more than 300 years. So he wanted to bring life into old institutions and just kind of change everything. And then what was interesting is as he became prime minister and started learning more about things, you could see him soften a little bit on that because he started to understand more about why things were being done. So what I think about and what this movie solidified for me is change is important and innovation is important, but you can do it in a way that respects the way things have been done. And if you can allow the time to learn and be curious about why things are done the way that they were, I think you'll have a more successful change process and a more buy-in from people who are currently working within an organization. As he continues his role, we begin to learn more about the Queen of England and kind of why she is the way that she is. She became queen at the very young age of 26. Her father became king after his father died. And he did have a brother who was older than him that could have been king, but he abdicated his role because he was in love with an American woman, and that was forbidden. So her father became king. And during that time, she volunteered in World War II as a driver and a mechanic. And the movie kind of shows different parts where she's driving on her own as she's driving through the countryside while they're on holiday. And it just kind of shows how at home she is in that, in nature and just independent. And then she became queen after her father died of lung cancer, and she was queen for 45 years at the time that Tony Blair became prime minister, and reminded him at their first meeting that she had worked with 10 prime ministers, the first being Winston Churchill. So she certainly, even at the time of when Tony Blair became prime minister, she had many years of experience under her belt. So as the months proceeded, things were just going along. That the movie just showed Tony Blair doing a lot of speeches about change and the establishment, and bringing privilege to the many, not the few. And then 4 months later, Princess Diana died. And he was really connected to the people of England. So he quickly made a statement and came out and spoke about Diana. And it showed his speechwriter coming up with the concept of the people's princess. And that really helped the people of England kind of connect and collectively mourn Princess Diana. Queen Elizabeth, on the other hand, was following protocol and tradition and didn't make any statements and wanted to really mourn in private. But as the weeks and days progressed, as I shouldn't say weeks, as the days progressed, the disapproval grew just so intensely against the monarchy and the queen for not speaking out. And they were just saying these terrible things about her, and the tide was really turning against the Queen of England. So Tony Blair, rather than joining the masses, if you will, and turning against the Queen, you could see his heart changing towards her and wanting to help her see the error of her ways. So they had a lot of different phone calls. And this is just a quote from one of the discussions when he was trying to say, speak out and help them with their grief. And she says, their grief, if you imagine I'm going to drop everything and come down to London before I attend to my grandchildren who've just lost their mother, then you are mistaken. I doubt there is anyone who knows the British people more than I do, Mr. Blair, nor who has greater faith in their wisdom and judgment. And it is my belief that they will at any moment reject this mood, which is being stirred up by the press in favor of a period of restrained grief and sober private mourning. That's the way we do things in this country, quietly, with dignity. That's what the rest of the world has always admired us for. And it was a very powerful part of the movie, and it reminded me sometimes of the indignant power that authority has over, this is the way we've always done things, and don't you even tell me that you know better than I do. And in her mind, she really thought she was doing the right thing. She, has been a queen for 45 years, and that her people have wanted her to be this stoic leader without emotion, and that's what she was taught to be like, and that's what she thought that her people wanted. But what she didn't know is that really wasn't what was happening. The people were turning on her and looking to her like, don't you have any feelings? What's going on? And Tony Blair saw that, but she didn't. So what the world really needed now at that point, and I thought a lot about this course, obviously, as I watched the film, was a man, when you think about how we learned about managers versus leaders. And a leader is somebody who thinks on a macro level versus a micro level. And she was focused on tradition and process and systems that were in place a long time. And he had a bigger understanding of things, and he was empathizing with the people and knew that they needed motivation. So he was flexible and willing to change and update the processes and some systems as needed to. He wasn't so stuck on kind of the way things always had been done. Another thing Tony Blair was really good at throughout the film was really explaining to people why things needed to change, and had an ability to empathize with the people he was talking to, whether it was people within the monarchy, the people of England, or people on his team. He showed great empathy and emotional intelligence, and really showed great social or self-restraint in times of, here he just starts this new role, and 4 months later, everything is falling apart. And I've been thinking a lot about the book that we had to, or the excerpt from the book we had to read in the class from John Kasich, that says nobody's going to remember you anyways, so you might as well walk that lonely road and fight the good fight and stand for something and do the right thing. And I thought about it. Now, in this case, everybody's going to remember them. So everything that they do is, you're in a fishbowl, and it's so public. So how can they make the right decisions while everybody's watching? So a lot of pressure. So this depicts a time when Tony Blair really had to do the right thing, even if it meant challenging the norms of now his own team. So there's a scene in the movie where they're kind of making fun of the Queen and mocking her and calling her names, and he loses it and kind of speaks really loudly and says this quote to them. That woman has given her whole life in service to her people, 50 years doing a job she never wanted, a job she watched kill her father. She's executed it with honor, dignity, and as far as I can tell, without a single blemish, and now we're all baying for her blood. All because she's struggling to lead the world in mourning for someone who threw everything she offered back in her face, and who, for the last years, seemed committed 24/7 to destroying everything she holds most dear. So if you think about that time when Princess Diana died, and at Buckingham Palace, the thousands of flowers that people were laying, and people were getting and gathering there and mourning her, how hard that must have been for her with everything that had happened. And Tony Blair really was about the only one that in the movie, anyways, that could really see that perspective. So I was thinking also about the decision making model that we learned about with the acronym SLEEP. So as you think about the need to make change, obviously, in this case, social was a very big part of this in how people were seeing the royal family and the social change. And then the legal and regulatory changes. I mean, there was established ways of doing things for how the royal family was treated, and how Diana's body was brought from France to England. I mean, there had to be meetings with all of these people on how to change the norms and the laws of how these things were handled. Economic, really changing the balance of power and privilege. The Queen was above the Prime Minister, but now Tony Blair is kind of switching it around and advising the Queen. So that was a change there. Ethical, really doing the right thing, even if it challenges authority in the way it's always been done. Obviously, political was a big part of it. And then educational, really trying to teach, as he started off, teaching people to think differently. But then as he began to learn more and empathize with the Queen, to really educate people on the why things were being done the way that they were. I also thought about the 4 factors of change. When you're thinking about making a change in this particular situation, obviously this wasn't what he was planning on with the implementations he was hoping to make with change. This was something that was forced upon him. So he needed to implement things quickly. And he needed to really rely on a lot of people to make the change. This wasn't something he could do on his own. The film shows just rooms of people always listening on phone calls and writing down things. It was a team effort in so many ways. There was hundreds of people involved in this. And he needed the commitment of people, and the commitment of his own people on his team, but then also within the monarchy as well. And he needed to motivate people to make hard choices and to think differently. A real pivotal point in the film was when you could really sense that public opinion was really turning against the Queen, and every article and every paper that they were showing just was saying terrible things about her, and you could really sense things changing. So Tony Blair made yet another call to the Queen, and you could sense the somberness of their conversation. And he explained to her in a very calm and specific and logical way, which I think really spoke to her, because that's how she communicates. So you could tell that before he tried to woo her with different emotions and things like that, and it didn't work. But this time he was very calm and specific and clear. And he shared with her that the situation had become critical. He shared that polls are coming out that 70% of people are against the Queen, that 1 in 4 would support abolishing the monarchy, and that he said that it was his constitutional duty as Prime Minister to implement, to suggest these changes. So this was very important to her, because upholding the Constitution is a key part of what her role is. So that was smart of him to use that language with her. So he made these 4 suggestions that she needed to do, that at this point, because of protocol and all that, she didn't want to do it. So he said, you need to have the flag at Buckingham Palace and all the other royal buildings half-mast. You need to leave where you're at because she was on holiday and go to London and be where the people are. And you need to attend the funeral and, pay your respects to Diana there. And you also need to make a public statement. And these were things she did not want to do. And you can tell by this picture just how difficult this was and how she knew she had to make this change. I think about the teamwork that had to happen for the power and the establishment to think differently at such a crucial time in history. The leaders within both the monarchy and within Parliament had to come together and work together, and just hundreds of people. And there was a great part in the movie right after the phone call that I just talked about, where the assistant who was on the phone along with the Queen called Tony Blair directly and kind of reached out to him and said, let me help you understand why she thinks the way that she does. And that, again, really helped Tony Blair to see things from her perspective. We have to challenge the norms within our own teams sometimes to work together, and we have to explain things in a way that the people we're communicating with understand. And if we do that right, and as this movie showed, the result is a new culture of collaboration. And the way that the Parliament and the monarchy came together was different. It used to be very siloed, and the monarchy was up here and the Parliament was down here, and now because of this they came together in a new way. This is a picture from the scene at the end of the movie that again goes back to tradition and modernization. So this is months after the funeral has happened and the Queen did her statement and implemented those changes that Tony Blair challenged her to do. And in the beginning, when they first met in this scene, it was the first time that they had reconnected after the funeral and everything happened. And it was awkward. He was trying to be friendly with her, and she was trying to be stoic, and you could feel the discomfort. But then as the moments passed, he empathized with her and again showed that emotional intelligence, just honoring her and saying, you really showed bravery and courage. And she said, well, I don't know about that. And she then opened up and kind of let her wall down and shared how hard it was for her to walk by the flowers at Buckingham Palace and read the signs people had written of, they to Princess Diana, like, they don't deserve you, the royalty is evil, and mean pictures of the Queen. And it really broke her heart. And there was a scene of a little girl who was standing at the palace and had flowers in her hand, and the Queen was like, do you want me to take those flowers and go lay them by the rest? And the little girl said to the Queen, no, those flowers are for you. And you could just really feel how much the Queen really needed that and needed to know that her people still loved her and respected her. So I really love how the lightheartedness of this picture that shows how the Queen was able to accept that she needed to change and be more collaborative, and Tony Blair respected that he needed to work with her and respect the traditions that she has. So as we close, there are 3 questions that really stood out to me as I thought of this film and this course when we think of change. First being, how can we be brave enough to challenge the establishment to think and act differently? In this film, it really required a lot of courage and bravery for Tony Blair to stand up and make things different. How can we make this change while respecting the current way of doing business? How do we get people to buy into what we want to do when they are kind of stuck in their ways and say this is how we've always done things? And then the final question, how can we be humble enough to accept that things need to change? When I think of the Queen and those difficult moments that she had of all of those years of training and protocol and doing things the way that you're supposed to, how can you be brave enough to change and humble enough to make that change? So thank you for your time on how being brave and respectful as a leader can really help in times of change.